Why wasn't Japan colonized? Who knows? Well, this video does, and I'm glad to have you with me. We're going to learn together today about Japan and why it wasn't colonized. Appreciate you guys for being here. Hit that subscribe button. Let's jump right in, shall we?
Saudi Arabia, Iran, Thailand, and Ethiopia were part of the small list of nations that managed to come out of the colonial era, having never fallen under the authority of a foreign nation, as the Americas, part of Africa, and parts of Asia all had. Another one of these foreign states who managed to slip through the cracks was Japan. The first thought that may come to mind when asked why Japan was never colonized may be the fact that they were actually a colonial empire themselves at one time. And this would actually be a good point. After acquiring control over the islands of Nanpo, Ryukyu, and Kurile in the 1870s through 80s, the Japanese empire began to shift its gaze further abroad. Taiwan was the first of these new territories to come under the Japanese crown, in this case, due to a treaty that...
So it seems like we're almost doing a reverse here, why and how Japan took advantage of this hemisphere. I'm wondering, I can't remember who was there before the Chinese Nationalist Party. Taiwanese people, like legit Taiwanese people. I forget who they were before Japan colonized them.
That had been signed at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. Next, Japan joined the Western colonial powers in trying to expand through East Asia, which eventually led them to annexing Korea and providing themselves to be a colonizer, not a colony. The Japanese continued on this path throughout the 20th century as well, seizing Sakhalin, some of Germany's colonial territories such...
Isn't that crazy that where he just circled on this map is part of Germany before that? How?
...as the Caroline Islands and Manchuria. The Japanese colonial empire would eventually meet its end in 1945, following the wrap-up of World War II. But during its existence, it had made the prospect of...
And look at that territory, and even parts of... The thing that kills me every time I think about it is if he does pan this map down a little bit past Indonesia and New Guinea, I think parts of Australia even was.
Anyone colonizing Japan itself utterly ridiculous. This means that for roughly 5...
Okay, there's been a map I've seen where parts of Australia was under rule. I'm not sure how true that was, but I've seen maps.
Decades, the reason why Japan wasn't colonized was simply because Japan was a colonizer. While this explanation seems the most obvious, and it's a sound argument, it still accounts for less than a full century, and the colonial era had started hundreds of years prior to Japan even becoming a colonial power itself. So what kept intruders at bay in the meantime? Well, Japan wasn't actually completely free of European interference. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to land in Japan when a group of Portuguese traders anchored their ship on the shores of Nipponese in 1543. A new relationship between Japan and Portugal suddenly began to grow, mostly centered on economics, but religion quickly became a talking point as well. Commerce was a huge factor in the Portuguese influence over Japan. Most of their trading goods were coming from China, which had long been off-limits to Japan after a ban of contact was...
And this paint is going to be from a Japanese POV, just the art style itself. You can tell that this is an Asian painting versus the Dutch painting, their own interpretation of this. So you get a POV of how Japan possibly portrayed the Dutch here. Not the Dutch, the Portuguese.
Put in place by the Chinese emperor. This meant that the Portuguese had something that the Japanese really wanted, but would be unable to get on their own. It was a perfect system, and worked well for a few decades. The Japanese could purchase goods like silk and porcelain from China without having to go directly through Chinese merchants. And the Portuguese were able to expand their influence into Asia even further. Firearms were another popular purchase of the Japanese, especially during the Sengoku period of civil war.
That's a crazy long civil war. We think of civil war as being like a few years, but this looks like it was 160 years. 150 years.
Unfortunately, not all of Portugal's endeavors in Japan were beneficial to the locals. Shortly after arriving, the Portuguese began to establish a successful slave trade, in which they would buy Japanese citizens, especially women, and sell them off to Europeans abroad. This new business grew rapidly, but it quickly became a concern of the contemporary Portuguese monarch. King Sebastian believed that the developing market would stain Portugal's evangelical Catholic reputation, particularly as they were trying to bring Christianity.
Or slavery is bad, and we don't even have to attach it to Christianity, just in general.
Into Japan. Unwilling to risk any complications it may cause any longer, Sebastian ordered a ban on the slave trade in 1571, although this didn't really do much at all. The trade continued, and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, known as the Great Unifier of Japan, was becoming increasingly angered by the entire situation. He was tired of seeing his own men and women being sold off by the hundreds, and decided to write a letter to the Portuguese Jesuit Vice-Provincial Gaspar Coelho, and informed him that his business must end, and that all slaves should be returned free to Japan. Some historians view this rage to be a bit hypocritical, given that Hideyoshi was participating in a mass slave trade himself.
Always. It's always this. It's always your people. It's always your people.
Only of Korean prisoners of war, instead of his own Japanese people. Nonetheless, Hideyoshi's anger continued to grow, and he began to blame the Portuguese Jesuits in particular. This, of course, was exactly what King Sebastian had hoped to avoid, but he had done too little, too late.
Japanese celebrating Christian Mass. Isn't that just crazy cool? Look at the detail of that table, the flower print tablecloth. And the candlesticks. Wow.
At his wits' end, Hideyoshi outlawed Christian evangelization from Japan. The slave trade wasn't officially banned until 1595, and the relationship between Japan and Portugal had been severely negatively affected by the entire situation. The Japanese now saw the Portuguese, and particularly the Jesuits, as a major threat to Japan's sovereignty. By the 17th...
Is it called Jesuits or Jesuits? It's probably called Jesuits.
Century, all ties with the potential colonial threat were severed, and the Portuguese didn't push the boundaries anymore. Although Japan did have some benefits to offer the Portuguese and other European powers potentially, it wasn't enough to make fighting back worth it. Realistically, forceful colonization of Japan would be near impossible. Not only had the Japanese purchased vast numbers of firearms from the Portuguese, but they'd also learned how to make their own.
That'll do it. That'll do it right there.
And considering the demands brought about by the Civil War period, the Japanese were ready and fully capable for battle. Additionally, Japan was a large country with a large population, especially compared to Portugal. Even for some of the bigger European powers, it would have been more of a challenge than it was worth, especially because of how far away Japan was from Europe.
Yeah.
Trying to ship large amounts of troops, even just enough to match the local population, from anywhere in Europe over to the Japanese archipelago would not have been easy, if even possible.
So, like, it wouldn't make sense for anyone really to even try. The only big superpowers in this region ever is China and then the Mongols. Those are the only that ever have existed in this area as a superpower regional to this area.
And there wasn't enough incentive. In terms of trade, natural resources, or any other strong motivation, Japan was simply lacking. There was nothing it had that the Europeans couldn't find or weren't already able to get elsewhere from their pre-existing colonies.
Right,
and
Africa.
that in itself was another factor. Portugal, Spain, and the other colonial powers were all preoccupied with their current colonies. To pull attention and possibly resources from those, any new territory would have had to been very attractive, and more so than Japan was. Lastly, things in Europe were far from peaceful, in multiple ways. For one, the array of colonial monarchies throughout the continent were not all necessarily allies.
Okay, so we're kind of like straining from the main point here, but we're just talking now that the Europe's preoccupied, which might be a reason of not colonizing Japan? Is that what we're going with?
Competition between them was not only unsurprising, but common, and European wars were by no means rare. This would have kept Portugal and the others not only distracted, but also at a risk of conflict with another rival European nation if any of them had decided to make a genuine effort in the direction of colonizing Japan. Furthermore, all of the Europeans still had to worry about foreign threats, such as
The Ottoman Empire? Or is this the Caliphate?
the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
And they were actively trying to expand and consolidate power in ways that directly conflict.
Let me read this. The Ottomans had a series of amphibious operations in the Indian Ocean in the 1500s against the Portuguese. The main reason for this conflict was economic. The main trade routes from the Far East to Europe were through the Ottoman Empire. After Africa had already been circumnavigated, meaning going around Africa, the Portuguese and other Europeans offered a new route for the import of goods. Because of this, the trade income in the Ottoman Empire decreased. Oh, okay, I get it. They were just upset that they were just greedy. They wanted a monopoly.
Colonialism. This kept Portugal and their rivals very significantly busy away from Japan, and greatly raised the bar for what Japan needed to offer in order to make colonizing it worth the effort. So the reason why Japan was never colonized was actually a combination of luck and the strength of the Japanese themselves.
It really just boils down to location to me.
Luck, of course, can account for the beneficial geographic position of the archipelago, being a far way away from major colonial powers.
Far East.
It can also be given as a reason for Japan's lack of resources that could have potentially drawn in more European conquerors. Moreover, the numerical and military strength of the Japanese, even centuries prior to becoming a colonial power themselves, was enough to make the Europeans be at an undeniable disadvantage in the case of an invasion. And when Japan did turn itself into a colonial empire, this was the
Japan became a power in the region after the imperial rule was restored in 1868 under Emperor Meiji. This period also saw Japan change from being a feudal society to having a market economy. Free market, okay. The Meiji Restoration accelerated the industrialization process in Japan, which was happening a lot in Europe at the same time, parallel, which led to its rise as a military power by the end of 19th century. So I'm guessing industrialization will also mean increasing arms, so building building weaponry, guns, having a standing military, ships, of course, and so forth.
Final nail in the long closed coffin of potential colonization of Japan. The tables had turned, and the Japanese were now the ones in power, not those being overpowered. The Portuguese may have had a risky opportunity to conquer Japan when they first arrived on the archipelago back in the 16th century, but it still likely would have ended in favor of the Japanese. Even if Portugal had not blown up its own chances by establishing the slave trade, or if King Sebastian had acted sooner in banning the market, this still would have come nowhere near guaranteeing a
What a cool painting here. This is also obviously Asian drawn, Japanese version of the painting. This looks like this. Is this the slave trade itself? We got like an exotic tiger here in the middle by the water. You can tell who's the Europeans versus who's not. Interesting. I don't know if this is depicting just. It looks like just like a. I was originally thinking this was slave trade, but it might just be mercantile. Like, just people trading.
Successful colonization attempt. More likely than not, if these circumstances hadn't gone wrong, something else would have.
Whoa, that's pretty cool. I just noticed there's... Wow, that's really good painting. I wish I owned this.
This means that Japan wasn't colonized because, more likely than not, it couldn't have been done without insane risk and sacrifice from whichever colonial power tried to get it done.
Yeah.
And the Japanese archipelago remained untouched by colonialism, aside from the short stint of the Portuguese.
Well, this was an interesting video. I honestly thought that he was going to talk a little bit more about the Mongol conquest being part of the combination, but they didn't speak much about that at all. You know, I put a couple pieces here and there together with like the Ottoman Empire and the Portuguese, and how that was a little bit of a skirmish in the Indian Sea. That's pretty cool. I didn't know that. But yeah, overall, yeah, Japan, it just boils down to geolocation. Such a risk. There's a reason why the Roman Empire only got so far into Great Britain, and why they couldn't go so far east or go so far south. It's just the further away from your home base is, the harder it's going to be to colonize or to conquest, whatever you may say. But nevertheless, appreciate you guys watching as always. Peace out. Bye-bye.